All the same, I thought myself a less likely pauper than corpse, and approaching both with neither speed nor trepidation, dreamed the dreary languor of this medial repose a passage to the nearest port, where I might yet be freed of the compulsion to believe myself conscripted to the screed of fixed horizons. It is my way to grieve what once was mine, to beat perforce another path, when, loosed from all the self-effacing credos of a fool, I can again, if not at last, exude the fetid humor of this incidental gash, a glancing wound that ever bleeds from nowhere towards the real. When I promenade in lockstep with each funeral procession I encounter on my way, and find in every prized and praising eulogy the giddy stimulation of solicitous reproach, when every faint distortion seems a respite from the swooning obligations of a tortured light, and no other can declaim a greater purpose than this shrift, lacking in composure the enchantment of utterance or caress, I croon the sonant gospel of extinction with a forced anomic smile to flow again as water spilled and gathered to the sea. When I warble it to pigeons preening on the trail, and think myself the fairest of all murderous successions long since driven from the drink, when I press to play the vaudeville guignol on that pretense of a stage, and dig a shelter for a grave in quiet, painfully delectable anticipation, pleading in recumbency for the cleansing inundation only such an incidental coda can complete. When the terra set beneath me seems no more reliable a perch than any melting iceberg drifting low upon the waves, and each new leap towards solid ground settles as another nervous wobble lurching sideways after plumb, then I account it high time to set out upon that most inscrutable of atmospheric lineaments, shimmering and distilled, making for the coast with as much haste as possible. If they but knew it, almost every suppliant would seek the same unalterable limits, off to sail the seamless grade upon which every tangent, every pivot. So call me what you will. Some time ago, never mind how long, having emptied out my pockets to reflect the void of interest I had once again presumed to limn my enterprise on land, I thought that I would hitch my line to some haphazard freighter, indiscriminate in choice of mate or ancillary crew, and survey some small portion of the remnants of the deluge, as though to take a measure of the failure of that carnage to achieve its due. Call me foundling or free, a penance too depraved to offer neither lineage nor birthright to repudiate or claim. This first flounce of acquaintance will not prove an easy target, and as such, I implore you to stay with me through the transit, guaranteed the pleasure of some forthcoming diversion in surrendering your easement to the runoff of this rancid rill. And just as other swindlers find the floodgates of the wonder world swung wide by the controlled conceits and undeliverable perils of some derogating code, so the prudent zeal of this crude penury of forms compels me to find entrance to a loftier derangement, following the course of any pathway through the thorns of lavish copse and threadbare thicket to a dreamed apotheosis, a fate assured as well as witnessed in a speechifying plunder of the harbor, then the Rhine. Is it so surprising, really, that those whose flesh is rent in twain by such abiding paragon of superfluent longings, whose elemental character has been avulsed asunder by the discharge of this otherwise gratuitous prognosis, should want to cast a glance upon the land they've left behind without a seeming trace? Have they overstepped all limits by their need to cleave the depthless whirl of poesy to their forswearing heels, that they might comprehend at least their least and ownmost stranding of such matte and leaden pearls for sodden souvenirs of searches ended in a prepossessing vagrancy? They, if any third now feigns a deft presentiment of footfalls still secluded from this pallid churn of figments into prosody, where the credulous dissemblance of some middle term insists its functionary compass points assume a Stygian transparency and equivalence of privations as means to reach the beaked front from which every furtive mariner sets forth, then what, or rather, who am I to ferret out the regress thus mistaken for a torrent, to bar the jest before I found the means to its discernment, as a game of tag where the only home is a tree stump on the far side of the ocean? Why not let that leaky tub float cautiously away from its phlegmatic harborage, image after image cruising vainly timewards in the name of some shrewd prowl? The pitying land would deign give succor, but in the gale that clot of rotted modicums presents an unmatched peril. With one small graze, the polished keel has scattered into timbers, and all the crew compelled to trade the vigor of the shallows for a shroud of sodden loam. Thus ye glimpse the mortally intolerable measure of a reasoned meditation, where every effort issues from the bucket mind's desire to keep itself afloat upon an independent main, against the overweening press of transcendental muck to cast that dinghy back upon the ravaged shore. But as in dispossession from the land resides the highest truth, indefinite as any godly spasm from the null, so better to vanish in the storm surge of that ululating squall than to beat one's head upon the cudgel of the lee, vergeless but approaching the next verge of some unbounded shoal. Still the rumpled wavelets will rise up to taunt the plunderers of flotsam with a promise of a pitch that can't be measured or inclined, that can't be, whose amusements, as it were, may well be warrantless in turn, but no facile reproof can lay such claim to an attention more compelling or inclusive, driven as a dancer who can't carry off a single pirouette without blunder, so bent on its refinement that there's no chance to rebalance before the stumbling plie. So it goes with me when my road is laid bare by the hunger to fall headlong from the crow's nest in despair, to throw myself into the maw that guarantees the scant estate of indisputability its ken, the sundering of depth from any surfacing facade, the shearing of the veil that rends the integral abyss. No evidence will abrogate the next arising outside without another surging forth to take its form and place, resigned to make my mark by skipping over once again, to draw my breath in viscous troughs hewn from the seesaw heaves, knowing that to sink would but enact another deficit, another loss. Thus, when I am once again and thoroughly repulsed by the repair of carking ditches in the desiccated marl, I take the limpid lacquer of the deep to be an image of the bottomless entelechy that permeates each shining thrum, perceivable in kind. There I have departed from the fickle thick of gore and skin, diffusing through the dissonance with every lapping wave of muddled skyline on the slopes of the new day, a freedom from all frittering defilements occasioned by my efforts to make tangible the topographic contours of the shore from which all similarly decorous prostrations must have already embarked. Each world is an island, accomplishing its shadowy remainder by accepting on the balance the discretion, the necessity for necessity is never indiscreet, of a monstrous decay into its other. The flesh is sad, alas, and I have nothing but words. I will not say that by this fickle, feckless toil I have offered up a model of my acquiescent landings, nor even a heuristic plot by which some more adventurous seafarer might think to hoist the serried flag above the surging azure of this littoral excursus. I would not wear the cap and sash of victory even if I could, for the unwavering vulgarity of every torpid analog, the regressive stupefaction of each attempt to replicate the play by which one first attempts to replicate. The interval that interrupts the dawning valedictory, that's wedged between all claims to realization and dispatch, certifies the imitative novelty of each and every represented harborage, as though the act of naming were the method and the portent of some forthcoming attack. Likewise, all compelled to put an end to such release, itself deprived of gang by a flippancy as irremediably deplorable as it is fatally full of interest, need only span the arid estuary on which the empty ship of state, lost among grasshoppers, stands in for this siren song of castaway remainders, a radial residuum at play upon the noose of the horizon. If an intellect transfixed by such crude transports can sufficiently subdue, in part by habit, in part by nature, the deficiency under whose weight it has been stifled from the start, it is just as well that I return for the second and last time to the allegory out of which this repetition issues, as a dreamer stepping into the miasma of the dream, the vanishing point of every next commencement in its series. But perhaps it is enough, this incorruptible remittance, a conditional that intimates its differential obverse, which is equally to say, perhaps it's not. Perhaps it never could be, and by this odd admission, always has been from the start. I'm sure the affirmation must read as premature, for having somehow drifted into this digressive dotage of an anecdotal form, but that remains beside the point, as though all sides unfolding inward find their edge and terminus in dwindling away. The avowal, rather, can seem nothing but absurd. At least the method signified by this tossing off of passions can't arouse the confidence of witnesses who think themselves the arbiters of lo these many fitful and perfunctory controls. Who will swear the character of lethargy that provokes this glib indulgence, or parry the hypnotic charm that turns this dynasty of detours from its endless drift? Not I, that is, not any I at all, no matter if such one should take this limit as the sign, the incarnation of a promissory hostelry or not. It simply makes no difference what justifies the placement of some otherwise anomalous phrasing, nor whether there's a reason to dissimulate the motif of this cipher of derangement, as long as it assumes a place within the general order it portends to circumscribe. Even as the presence of oxygen can be deduced by the ignition of a glowing match, so the prudent auditor of this narrative contrivance will recognize the accomplishment of my duty by the zeal I betray in returning to the point, preferring the droll rhapsody of these dissembling protestations to an imperious lucidity of absences. One might be right to think the insistence of this account a disaffection by concealment, a darkening of the window glass so that the yawn of an abyss appears to open in its frame. But it would be an error to consider that evasion is the turning out, so the defilement of virtue. Every broad description of depth confers a contiguity of surfaces. The ostensively remedial indulgence of this circle of denials is the only sum affirmed by any truly figurative praxis. I will return, I will turn back. To what? Already the inceptive vault effuses with the redolence of coming inundations. Already I await some eager heretic to tap me on the shoulder, delivered from the fall that strikes the aforementioned dancer by having failed to suffer even momentary discharge into graceless flight. Thank you.